Back in 2000, Pokemon Crystal was released, and let me tell you, I ate that shit up. I don't know how many hundreds of hours I put into that game, other than its multiple hundreds. As much as I liked it, after a while I just stopped playing. I just moved on to other games, I guess. Eventually, thanks to what was probably peer pressure and not wanting to be more uncool in middle school and high school, I made the conscious choice to not go back. Even as recently as the release of Scarlet Violet, I had no interest in playing the games again. Never even crossed my mind as a possibility. However, for reasons I don't quite remember, over a month ago I asked my boyfriend if I could take his copy of Scarlet since he had bought both Scarlet and Violet and had played Violet. Much to his chagrin, in hindsight. Little did I know, I actually really like Scarlet. I mean, really liked it. I think in the last couple of weeks, I got 70 plus hours in and completed all the story content, including the tournament. One might be inclined to wonder, both how and why, I would play Scarlet when there is so much animosity toward it, what with the obvious graphical and performance issues. It might be because I had such low expectations going in that it could only go up from there. I mean, I loved the Terra raids. It was nice to play a Pokemon game in an open world. Get to that a little bit later. There are all these new Pokemon I'm seeing after 20 plus years. And who would have known that surprise trades for OP Pokemon and Shinies would have been so engaging for me? I had no concept of most of these facets of the game before playing, which could have been a factor. After all, I hadn't really heard anything about those parts, so what a joy they were. Now with all that, after playing through Scarlet about as much as I could, I went out and picked up Pokemon Shield since my boyfriend had already had Sword. And just, wow, real glad I played that after Scarlet. It was definitely an experience. That brings me to the whole point of this video, which is basically discussing my experience with certain aspects of the games, mainly the graphics and performance, and what it was like going from Scarlet to Shield. Specifically, whether it retroactively affected the fun I experienced playing Scarlet. First and foremost, I gotta talk about the graphics. I mean, it's the giant fanpea in the room, and can't really be a conversation about Scarlet without talking about the graphics. There should be able to be a conversation without that, but here we are. But before I go any further, I need to get out of the way that I do not blame the devs for any issues. I blame management, the Pokemon Company, Nintendo, and end-stage capitalism for demanding it be released on such a tight schedule and making the decisions that they did. That's the real issue, but we don't really have time to go into that. Anyway, the graphics. On its foundation, the graphics are fine? I mean, truly. I know it's a hot-button issue for the game, but take a look at some of those scenes and try to remove your preconceptions, forget about what other games have looked like, and just see them in isolation. They are, like I said, fine. When you're flying on your Koraidon, you can see waves in the grass, the towns are somewhat vibrant, you can see all the way across the map, mostly. If nothing else, it is at least competent regardless of what they could do given their resources. On the other hand, the color palette is pretty washed out, especially when you head west of Mesa Goza to the Bug Gym. That area is so brown and sad. I was legitimately worried the rest of the game was going to be like that. Even without comparing it, it does look like they wanted to go for a slightly more realistic, less cartoony look. I think that was a mistake, but I've seen other people say they really like it, which is perfectly fine and valid. In some areas, there's not really much of anything. Near your home, there's a lot of terrain height differences and cliffs. Your house is all colorful with lots of landscaping. But then there are places elsewhere where it's just a road and a cliff, or a road and a plain with maybe a few trees. NPC character models are pretty alright. One of the graphical highlights, honestly. This actually also applies to the Pokemon as well. It's clear that a decent chunk of development time was spent on this, and considering it's called Pokemon, it makes sense they'd want them to be modeled well. But then, I moved on to Shield. Just wow! It's still a Switch game with all of its power limitations, but I thought this game was absolutely gorgeous. Everything looks like the saturation was cranked up to, I don't know, maybe an 8 or a 9. The game resolution is a bit middling, but they make it work. I mean, pixelated games look beautiful all the time. Just look at Blasphemous 2 or Octopath Traveler. And don't even get me started on that town in the forest with the mushrooms. Actually do, because that place was so pretty and honestly a vibe. It's just a shame it's such a small area. I certainly didn't go away without issues. Particularly in the wild areas, there are plenty of texture pop in, particularly with interactable objects like trees and the Pokemon themselves. Gotta tell ya, not a huge fan of riding around on my bike only to run face first into a Pokemon that spawns right out of nowhere. I also had a few instances where the frame rate absolutely hit rock bottom. Mainly happened during like sandstorms, and honestly it only happened a couple of times. Then there are the obvious performance differences between the games. In Scarlet, barely a second went by before some textures wouldn't load, and the ground would look like a static JPEG with no grass or movement, or the game would slow down to a solid 5 frames per second for like 10 seconds because I just happened to be looking too far into the horizon while gliding. That's not even to mention all of the NPC character models in the towns around the world that were a frame per second once you move like 10 feet away from them. To me, that is the most egregious issue with performance in the entire game. While I am not a game dev, I do understand that there are considerations for the amount of computing power the system has and rendering whole worlds. I know that after a certain distance, the resolution and rendering has to take a hit. But at the same time, I know there are tricks to make it work. The obvious comparison is Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, or even Xenoblade Chronicles. It is possible to make it work. Please, Pokemon Company, if you're going to continue making 3D games, then allow the devs to polish and optimize the games, and get help from other Nintendo devs if you need to. Don't even do that for our sake, do it for the sake of the devs, if nothing else. Otherwise, it's really easy as critics to talk about what went wrong with performance because the concept of just having the game work is kind of the expectation for gamers. Like, I didn't say how the concept of Pokemon was so cool because I just expect that as the baseline experience in a Pokemon game. We just expect the game to function without huge bugs. We're at a point where we as a gaming community expect polish, especially from a company with money and resources. Although, that being said, I at least never had Scarlet crash. It dropped frames like nobody's business, but it managed to hold itself together even in the most dire circumstances. Temtem, on the other hand, that thing could not work for longer than an hour on my Switch without crashing. Honestly, to their credit, the Pokemon Company may have spent their optimization work to keep the game stable while the graphics took a hit. That is just a complete guess. But then, why was Shield so pretty with almost no issues? Like I said, I had some frame dips in trees, and Pokemon would occasionally pop out of nowhere, but it wasn't terribly frequent. I would have thought that if anything was going to cause performance issues, it would have been the raid battles or the Dynamax dungeon with other people online, but the game always held itself together just fine. Well, the netcode to connect with other players wasn't always the best. I got booted out several times or just wasn't able to connect for one reason or another, but not enough that it really soured anything, just, kind of soured. But otherwise, Shield was just subjectively better in almost every way. Beautiful, saturated graphics, smooth performance, cute legendaries, fun side characters, etc. So, did going back and playing Shield retroactively sour my experience with Scarlet? Honestly, only a little bit, but otherwise not really. It truly is not possible to be a human and not compare things. That's just not really a thing. So I can't play either of these games without comparing them to each other. For Scarlet, as I've mentioned already, I can't help but wonder what happened. Why was the performance in the wild areas of Shield so much better than Scarlet? Was it just because they made the areas so mountainous in the Shield DLCs that they could get away with rendering less? And if that's the case, why not build the world similarly so you can cheat around the issue? And why can't we get Pokemon Crystal on the Nintendo Switch online store? And Shield is not free from negative criticism in comparison either. Even if it wasn't the highest resolution, flying around and looking at the scope of the world in Scarlet was wondrous, and I missed that while playing Shield. I also really hated the bike after being able to climb around on my Koraidon. Also, every time I had to stop in Shield to pick up a glowing item on the ground, I wanted to go back to Scarlet where I could just run over them while tapping A. Another slightly unrelated issue I've had with both games is confusion regarding progression. Scarlet is billed as an open world, but you have to follow a somewhat bilinear path because enemies aren't scaled, so that kind of undercuts its own open world. Shield was a bit better, but even it had a similar issue with random difficult Pokemon in the wild area, and the DLCs also almost immediately available, but effectively forcing you out because your level's too low. From my experience online since the release of both games, it looks like people's complaints of Scarlet are mainly or mostly limited to graphics and the performance. Well, and also not having every single Pokemon, but I don't really have a meaningful opinion on that one. But otherwise, the core systems of Scarlet are functionally the same. I've also heard people that generally don't like the game talk about how the story is actually pretty alright, and many actually like the characters, although I found them to be a bit silly for my taste. That said, graphics and performance issues, like they are in Scarlet, are often not enough to deter players, or are often not enough to elicit such a negative reaction from so many people. Other games with similar issues may not have such vocal opposition. I think, as I kind of alluded to before, the actual issue isn't either the graphics or performance per se, but a feeling of being cheated or lied to. We know that Pokemon Company's bottom line is just fine, and we know from previous games that they can look and perform better if you just give them enough time. But Pokemon Company really led us to believe that Scarlet and Violet were going to be these beautiful, functioning open worlds, and that the open world, which some Breath of the Wild devs consulted on, was going to be this amazing game changer. But they didn't. By all accounts, it felt like they just developed a cheap cash grab, scamming us out of our money when we look at all that they have made and compare it to the resources we know that they have. This, to me, feels like a more honest and real complaint than just saying that the graphics aren't as good as we want compared to, Sword and Shield. However, in spite of my human predisposition to compare things, it is so important to stress that in spite of all these issues I had, I still had an absolute blast with both games. Even immediately going back to Shield and seeing how Scarlet kind of stumbled in a lot of ways, I still go back to Scarlet to play, especially with the current Mew/Mewtwo event, and I am absolutely going to eat Scarlet's DLC up. I mean, T, are you kidding me? And I made the point that Scarlet could feel like a cheap cash grab. But remember that I didn't buy the game. It was basically gifted to me by my boyfriend. That could be a factor in why I liked Scarlet as much as I did, even in hindsight. I don't have the lingering resentment of 20 plus years of expectations and then spending money on it and having those expectations dashed. Also, I myself can have substantial criticism with many of a game's core elements and still have fun in spite of it. I mean, I liked the Risen series of games, so I can clearly enjoy a 4 out of 10 game. That is sort of what happened here. But I also think it's important to reiterate that Scarlet is not a bad game on its own. If anything, it's just less than what it could or should have been. If Pokemon didn't exist before and this game came out, people would have thought it was amazing. That said, I know that's kind of an idealistic view because it's difficult, if not impossible, to view things in a vacuum like that. And, like I said, it kind of feels like a, oh, they'll buy it anyway sort of situation. And you know what? We did. Either way, that was my experience with Scarlet and Shield, and also some of my thoughts on why its issues didn't really bother me that much. I know there are plenty of criticisms to be had, including by me already, so what I want to hear in the comments are people's positive experience with either or both generations of games. Otherwise, if you made it here, feel free to like and subscribe to see whatever it is I decide to do next.